first of all, let's talk about your name, Kestrel Blue. How did that come about?
This is a bit of a story and a half, but I'll try and make it as concise as possible. The name sort of came out of my time as a master's student at Ryerson University, now called Toronto Metropolitan University. And what I was studying there was music and cognitive semiotics, which is basically like how music means things. What I was really interested in was how music comes to mean different things, because it doesn't always mean the same thing all the time. It sort of evolves. And my question was, okay, so how does creativity come into this? How do new things happen? Because a lot of the time when people talk about music, it's always, the major scale is happy. Like it's this static thing that's forever true. So during my research into all of that, I came across basically this idea that a lot of creativity is sort of done through mistakes and doing things slightly wrong. And one story that illustrated this idea was this writer named Walker Percy was on a nature walk, and his guide pointed out a bird. He said, that's a blue dollar hawk. And it turned out later, Walker Percy found out that that was not the right name for the bird. It was a blue darter hawk, which makes a lot more sense. But he thought, wow, blue dollar hawk, that is a lot more evocative and sounds a lot more interesting. So I was originally going to call this sort of project Blue Dollar Hawk, but that sounded a little bit cumbersome, and there's already a guitar apparently called Blue Dollar Hawk. So I started just thinking about that idea, birds, blue colors, and I thought, okay, well, kestrel is my favorite bird. It's the smallest of the falcons, which I think suits me, being 5'5" and everything. And I thought about like the color of a kestrel. It's kind of blue, it's kind of gray. If you say the name Kestrel Blue, there's not really one single color that corresponds to. And I thought that sort of captured that idea of, how things sort of, when you don't get something quite right or when things are unclear, that is the moment when things sort of happen creatively and the way clears for innovation and things like that.
And actually, the two words together look pretty cool. They do, actually. But it was interesting what you were saying about the music and how it comes to be. And of course, like people like John Cage, he wanted whatever happens.
Yes.
It can either be very structured or just let's see what happens.
And I mean, one of the influences on my master's research was Frank Zappa, who kind of combines both of those things. It's completely controlled chaos. It sounds absolutely chaotic, and it sounds like it makes no sense, but everything is done to a meticulous level of detail. I believe he wrote out a lot of those parts. So I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Curated randomness.
Yes.
That's a good way to look at things. How would you describe your music?
Another one that I need to consciously make concise. I usually tell people that it's alternative rock with singer-songwriter influences and a little bit of jazz. The long answer, and I'll try not to make it too long, is it has to do with the way that my previous band dissolved. So I'm originally from Oshawa, and I was in a band in Oshawa for a few years called Red Violet. Just three of us, but when it came time to actually enroll in the master's program that I just talked about, I had to move to Toronto, and the other two weren't coming with me. So the band broke up, and that's natural and that happens, but I thought it was a shame that, I had all of these songs that I'm still pretty proud of with this band that were kind of, they kind of had no life anymore, like I couldn't play them myself, or it would feel wrong to. So when I started doing this current project, Kestrel Blue, I thought, okay, I'm going to write every song, or I'll at least try to write every song so that it could work either as a singer-songwriter song, just me playing acoustic or just playing one electric guitar, or it could work as a full band. And that's how I'm going to try and arrange and write all of the music. And so, yeah, I think that's part of what makes Kestrel Blue unique, is that sort of creative limitation.
And you have new music recently released.
That's correct, yes. Other translations released days before my birthday back in May. The songs on there are pretty much a collection of like every sort of like musical thoughts and idea that I thought was worth saying over the past 5 years or so. Yeah.
The first song, Bloom of Youth, that's a great way to start the album.
Thank you. It's funny that you bring up that one, because it was the most temperamental song. It's got the densest arrangement. It was very hard to mix. And at the same time, that first lyric, let's not care about being young, that was the first lyric that was conceived on the entire record, which is funny. So I was about 22 when I thought about that lyric, which is funny because it almost sounds like like an older person's sentiment, but I was sort of already 22 and thinking about like feeling all of this pressure, because I think that's sort of something that's easy to forget as you leave the sphere of the ultra young, which I'm doing now, I suppose. My 20s are kind of like draining away now. I think it's easy to forget that with a lot of the sort of like cultural cachet and privilege that youth has, it comes with a lot of pressure, including the pressure that it's not going to last forever. So even when I was 22, I was thinking, sod all of this, because one of these things, I'll try not to dwell too long on it. One of the things that annoys me a little bit, I think, is when people talk about how, the coming generation is going to fix everything, because it's a little bit of a con. They sort of like build up, and I fell for it too when I was, 16. They build up the next generation. Your generation's they're going to save us, right? And then that's a lot of pressure right there. And then almost, 98% of the people who buy into that message are going to disappoint themselves. And they shouldn't, because you don't owe the world anything more than your best. You don't need to save the world. That has to be a collective thing involving cross-generational energy. And then so I think it's really cruel the way that we like build up young people, and then their 26th birthday, which is still absurdly young, happens, and they feel, quarter life crisis. What am I doing?
You're quite right. It should be cross generations. That's for sure. Yeah.
But the funny thing about that song is it was if you count that first initial lyrical idea, it was the first song started on that record and was the last one finished.
Oh.
Yeah, because it took so long to arrange and to mix that I was working on it right up until I had to say, okay, it's done now. Just finish it.
That must be difficult, though, saying, okay, it's done for some songs.
Oh, incredibly difficult. And that's why it took so long to finish the record, because I'm an artist who I really relate to is Peter Gabriel, because one member of his backing band, I forget who it was, they said, I think it might have been Tony Levin actually, said, Peter Gabriel always thinks his next record is going to come out in 9 months. And it's like at least 6 years before it comes out.
9 months in dog years or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I related to that statement because I always think, okay, if I really put my nose to the grindstone, I can like get out an EP in 4 months or something. But it doesn't work out that way because I don't want to settle for at least less than what I know I can do at that time. Like maybe it's, even with all my combined energy, it's not going to be, as polished as a song that's, recorded by, a pro producer or something, or, it might not be as elegant as something Paul Simon writes, but I at least want it to be up to my own standard.
When you say at that time, your best at that time, would you ever think of going back and revisiting your music?
It's funny that you mentioned that because just yesterday I was thinking, you know what, if I ever get, if ever the clouds part and I get a chance to sort of redo the record with, I don't know, like the equivalent of George Martin producing, and it's at Abbey Road or something, like I would do that, and I would call it something like New Variations or something like that.
You mentioned lyrics. That one of your songs, it begins, you want to be Jack Kerouac, I wanted to be Bob Dylan. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting way to start.
Yes. That song is actually based off of a real person, but a person who I actually never knew personally. So her name was Leah Roberts. She disappeared in Washington State around, I think it was 2000. She was originally from North Carolina. What happened to her was she kind of went on this sort of Chris McCandless style journey across the country. I think both of her parents died, and she just kind of like dropped out of school and went to Washington State, and something happened to her and she was never seen again. Her car was found, but no one knows what happened to her. And I was sort of really moved by this story because I think she was very young, like 19 or something. And I remembered, sort of being that age, which was, at the time when I was first thinking of this song, I was only not that much older than she was. But I remember being that age and really kind of wanting to do the same thing, like, oh, don't worry about school, do the Bob Dylan thing and like go to New York and live in on the side of the road for 6 months until you make your big break kind of thing. I just started thinking like about how there were these parallels, like around the same age. My mother passed away, and but she kind of went one way, in a different time and place, but it took one path, and then I sort of took the path being like, oh no, I can't run away. I'm gonna sort of like do what I know is kind of right for me and sort of like see what I can do here, And the song is kind of like, I want to make it not sound too self-centered because it can sound terrible. Oh, this person's gone missing, and I'm like, comparing this person to my own life. But it's not really like that. It's really a song about understanding the mindset, even across years, across generations, and a person I never knew. Like really trying to understand the impulse of what made this person do this thing. That if someone were to just read it on a piece of paper and be callous about it, could say, oh, that was stupid to do, or what I mean, like what were you doing? You put yourself in danger. It's like, no, like sometimes people do rash things for good reasons. The sort of addendum that I feel the same way about Chris McCandless. The person that Into the Wild is about. People all the time sort of like dunk on him and say he did something stupid. It's like, okay, maybe it was stupid. Maybe there were flaws there, but it doesn't mean that what he did was meaningless, or that we can't understand it.
The one thing about your releases, I was wondering who illustrates the covers with the various birds. They're quite nice. So
that's me, but with a heavy caveat that a lot of the covers are sort of like legal plunderphonics. There's an amazing institution called the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands, and they're a fine art museum, but they've done a really, really cool thing in that they've made their entire collection freely available to download, and the rights are such that anyone can use anything for whatever they want, including commercial purposes. So my process when I'm creating, a show poster or an album cover, whatever, is a little bit different from with other translations. For example, the woman on the cover is my friend Sarah, and I took that photo and everything. But with the birds and stuff, it's I'll go on to Rijksmuseum. I'll type in bird or like hawk or something like that. I'll find usually a small detail of a painting that looks interesting because all of the images are razor sharp. I'll zoom in and then I'll screw with it in some way. I'll change the colors. I'll invert it, or I'll crop something out, and then I'll drag in my my logo that my dad so helpfully designed for me, because he was a graphic designer for 30 years. And and that's how it usually happens.
Very cool.
Thank you very much.
So do you have plans for the next few months?
Yes. Just got back from Toronto, where I was demoing songs for the next Kestrel Blue album. And I'm hoping to sort of fully demo that by the fall. So maybe we can record and release something next year. I mean, of course, I just mentioned the Peter Gabriel thing of, we could be,
So about 4 years from now.
Yeah, exactly. Could be 4 years from now. But, if I have the timeline of it's going to be 4 years from now, it'll be 8. So might as well think of a year from now and then see how fast we can go.
Well, we look forward to that.
Thank you.
So should we talk albums?
Yes, let's.
Now, your go-to album, tell me about it.
My go-to album is Skylarking by XTC. And I chose to put this album in this category because I knew I needed an XTC album in there somewhere. They're just too good, and they're too much of one of my favorite bands to not appear on this list. And when I thought of go-to album, I think of an album that I can put on no matter what mood I'm in, no matter what time of year it is, and I'll be like, oh yes, this is a solid record. And so of all of the XTC albums, the one that fits that description most is Skylarking, which is just one of these albums where it's like perfectly, I don't want to say perfectly sequenced, because it was even released in different track listings and stuff, but it's just so self-contained. It's from the mid 1980s, I think 1985 or 86.
86.
Yeah, 86. And it doesn't, to me, sound very much like 1986. But it doesn't sound like it's not from the 1980s either. It just sounds like its own thing. And I think when it comes to records that are timeless, that's one of the components of it is, it sounds like it's just being its own thing. And I think that's going to be a theme that we return to as we talk through some of the other records. But yeah, a highlight track from Skylarking, I think, is Earn Enough for Us. Obviously, Dear God is the most famous song of that record, and I really like that song. But Earn Enough for Us, it kind of represents the album in the same way. When I listen to that track, I'm like, wow, this is not missing anything. I don't think you could enhance it in any way, right? Like, it's just, when it finishes, you're like, yeah, that was like a really well-written song. And that's kind of how I feel about the album as a whole, too.
Now, the album was produced by Todd Rundgren.
Yes.
And from what I've read, there were discussions between XTC and Todd, and disagreements possibly. But in the end, Skylarking came to be. Yeah.
I am mostly familiar with Andy's side of the story, Andy Partridge, the sort of main songwriter. So I guess you have to keep that in mind. But according to Andy, Todd Rundgren was a little bit of a bully on that record. Like Andy would do a vocal take, and Todd would be like, "That was trash. Listen, I'll sing this song so you can hear how it should be sung, and you will listen to it, and then you'll sing it the right way." Which is, that would be, for me as a vocalist, that would be a nightmare. That would really kill my confidence. But maybe there's an argument to be made that, working under that pressure was maybe good for them. I don't know, or maybe it was the songs are so good that it succeeded despite the interference. From what I understand, a lot of the record was inspired by the Beatles and like even stuff like Beach Boys, Pet Sounds, and stuff like those sort of cyclical albums from the 1960s, where songs would crossfade into each other. There was kind of like a unified theme to the album, which, to his credit, apparently that was Todd Rundgren's idea, was to sort of like unify the record into, it kind of like encapsulates a lifetime, apparently. Very, as much as it, like, I would never mistake that record for a 60s record. No. But you can definitely tell that there's a 1960s influence there.
Yeah, that's fair to say. Yeah, definitely. Now, the first album you bought.
Yes. So I think I might be cheating a little bit with this answer, just because, I definitely owned albums before this, but to the best of what I can recall, they were albums that were like bought for me for, Christmas or something. The album that I remember first, like taking my money when I was in high school and like going to HMV when it existed at the time and forking over my money for the record was Icky Thump by the White Stripes. Yeah, who, by the way, are my favorite band of all time still.
So did you go to HMV with that album in mind?
Oh, yes, most definitely. It's funny. It's funny how the mind of a teenager works. I'm like 16 at this time, 15, 16. And I remember, up to this point in my life, I had really just listened to like what we would call classic rock, right? So it was like really big Rush fan. Still I am. It was like the quintessential like early teenage boy band, was really into Queen from a very young age. And, like, yes, Simon and Garfunkel, like pretty much, anything before 1985. But I remember like hitting like 15 and being like, I'm at the age now where like, I should be like going to shows and like my favorite band should be a band of like my generation. I was sort of like self-aware enough to think of this, that's just the way it should be. So I actually went on kind of a little bit of a hunt for like bands that, they would be, like kind of like of my generation kind of thing. And I sort of like listened to them and checked them out and auditioned them. And I found a lot of good music that way. It's how I found, Fleet Foxes and stuff. But I remember the first band I actually found was the Hives, because I saw them on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, of all things. And I was like, wow, this band has energy, this is a legit band. And then I started listening to them, and then, the iTunes store, good old iTunes store, started recommending me these other bands. This is how I found like the Strokes, and then I found actually the Rack Hunters first. And then I found the White Stripes, and what made them my favorite band was I found this clip on YouTube of them performing at the Grammy Awards in 2003. They played Death Letter, and then they play Seven Nation Army, the hit, of course, but then they sort of subvert expectations and then go into Death Letter. Which is like an old Sun House cover, and then they go completely crazy. I remember thinking like, oh, this is like, when you see old footage of the Ramones and stuff, but they're doing it at the Grammys. I thought that was so cool. And, when I see Grammy performances now, I'm always disappointed because nothing comes close to what the White Stripes did for that performance. So yeah, by that time, when I went to purchase Icky Thump, they were already my favorite band. And I was like, yeah, now I'm going to go and I'm going to buy this physical CD with my own money. And, it's kind of heartbreaking because I remember sort of like being excited, like, oh, like I found my favorite band. It's like, White Stripes are a little bit earlier than my generation, I guess. But like, they're a current band. I'm going to go like see them on tour and I'm going to like, get excited for their records and stuff. Icky Thump was the last record they ever released. I got into them like, I think like 2 months after like their final Canadian tour ended. It's the big one where they like went across the entire country and played small towns and stuff. So it was like, okay, well, I guess that's luck for you, but hindsight's 2020.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Now, an album that stands the test of time.
Yes. An album that stands the test of time is Highway 61 Revisited by Bob Dylan. I don't know what else to say about that one, except like it holds up after, that was, when was that released? 1966, I think. To me, like, I think it has something to do with how expressive Bob Dylan's voice is. When like people say he's a great singer, yeah, I really buy into that idea because like his voice, you can still tell how he felt, like, because he was also writing those lyrics at that time from a very personal place, which is not something that you necessarily feel, I think, even with artists who are, were farther along in time. Like there are a dozen sort of like semi-generic new wave bands from the 80s where, it kind of sounds like the singer is like going through the motions and, it sounds like that's what makes it sound like the 80s, but Bob Dylan, again, this thing, it doesn't sound like the 60s beyond the fact that he's just an icon of the 60s. But it sounds, like he could still be talking about his feelings like now. Like I still relate to some of the things that he clearly feels on those records, like a Rolling Stone. That song is almost a very mean song in some ways, but I would be lying if I said I never felt that sort of like, oh yeah, you got what you deserved kind of feeling. Like, yeah, go and, like, I know you're going through a hard time, but you know what, you kind of deserve it kind of thing, and not to say that is, like always justified emotion, but it's definitely relatable. More relatable than I think like other, as I said, other songs that were released, in the 80s or the 90s, where it's just kind of like, yeah, oh baby, yeah, come on, let's dance. Which is, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I like songs that have that sentiment, but those songs are less likely to stand the test of time. Like those songs, like they really need a great bass hook or something to stand the test of time, as opposed to, that sort of like very like raw and very relatable emotion that Bob has on this record.
So would you have found that album when you were listening to Rush and Queen, or did
yes, you? I remember it's changed now. Its scope, it plays sort of all eras of rock now. But there was a radio station in Toronto, GTA area, called Q107, and it's kind of like what everybody listened to, when you were 13, that was actually how I found Rush too. Like I was, I think 12, 13. And during the sort of lunch break, my friends put on Q107 and Limelight by Rush was playing. And, hey, what song is this? I thought it sounded so cool. And similar moment with Bob Dylan. I remember it was, I think, Thanksgiving. They were counting down the greatest songs of all time, and I didn't, it was a lot more interesting for me then than a similar list would be for me now, because now I know all of the predictable picks, right? It's like, oh yeah, of course, like, like Great Gig in the Sky, like Pink Floyd is going to be on there
Stairway
somewhere.
to Heaven.
Yeah. And I remember number 2 was Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan. And I remember listening to it and being very taken aback by the way that Bob was singing. Like, wow, he's, he didn't hit that note at all, but at the same time, it was interesting, and I wanted to listen to it again, and so that was a really illustrative moment for me. I think, like, listening to that song, and I just thought that was really, really cool. And it also, same day that introduced me to Day in the Life by the Beatles, which was number 1. So, yeah.
And what you just said about him not hitting the note, that sort of goes back to what we were saying before about music either being very structured and I want this to be perfect, or that's fine the way it is.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think even there are times on Blonde on Blonde, the next record, where I think he's doing that, like, very much on purpose. Like he's not going for a note. He's just, and I think people forget that he was capable of not doing that. Like the example that always gets brought up is, Lay Lady Lay, who was on Nashville Skyline. He does this country crooner thing. But even like his earlier records, you listen to like Blowin' in the Wind, he's hitting every note fine there. It's a little bit, he's got a bit of a twang. It's a bit bright sounding. But he's hitting every note just fine. He just sounds like a little bit of a country bumpkin, which was what he was going for at the time. I'm a folk singer kind of thing. When people are like, "Oh, like Bob Dylan can't sing," it's like, no, he can. Like, you need to understand that's what he was going for.
Right.
Like, yeah.
Now, a Sunday morning album.
My Favorite Things by John Coltrane. One of these things is not like the others on this list.
That's true.
But I picked this record because, one, I knew I needed a jazz record on here because I love jazz so much. I kind of have this semi-logical feeling that, like, jazz is, like the purest music or something like that. Not because it's improvisational, though, like is the stereotype, but more because it is so, like, it's as complex as like a great surrealistic painting is complex, in my opinion. Like it's like it kind of just, there's so many layers to it in the same way that like a painting, I think there's a reason why, like, Charles Mingus, for example, has, like, a lot of his records had sort of abstract art and things as their covers. And the reason I chose My Favorite Things specifically was because of a memory that is a little bit different from Sunday Morning, but is close enough. It was the first time I went back to the house that I grew up in after moving away. It was after I'd moved to Toronto for school. And I remember, even though that was a very exciting experience, it was a somewhat, I don't want to oversell it, but somewhat traumatic experience in some ways. Because like living in Toronto with my girlfriend at the time, it was kind of a wake-up call in the sense that, like, oh, like, there are people who live here who will be mean to you for no reason, which is, not as much the case in, Oshawa, where, it's smaller and I kind of like, it's small enough that you run into people, downtown, and everybody's kind of friends and stuff like that, and like, oh, and, you need to worry about, violent crime, like I remember that first year that I moved out, there was, a shooting on the intersection one way down the road. And there was, I think 6 months later, another shooting at the other intersection going the other way.
Oh, no.
Down the road. So all of that was kind of a wake-up call. And I remember at Thanksgiving, I went back to my dad's place, and I remember, he left to pick up my sibling who was also going to come back home. And I sort of like had the house to myself. And this is not in Oshawa proper, but it was in Curtis, which is very small, semi-rural, semi-suburban. You can hear the birds. Clearly, it's the loudest noise, is the birds chirping. I just thought, like, wow, it is so peaceful here. So I went over to the computer, which had pretty good speakers, and I put on My Favorite Things by John Coltrane, and I just felt so calm and peaceful. And it, the sound of the record sounds a little bit to me like Charlie Brown, like the jazz piano music, except, John is doing some crazy experimental things on his saxophone, but it's not a Frank Zappa thing where it's adding chaos. It's, adding to kind of like the sublime beauty of it. It's like very weird and very strange, but very weird and very strange things can be beautiful too. So because of that feeling that I sort of remembered from listening on Thanksgiving, and it might have been a Sunday, it might have been Thanksgiving Sunday. I sort of thought, oh yeah, that's the same sort of feeling that you want from a Sunday morning album.
And it has his version of Summertime on there.
Yes.
And that's quite special.
Yeah. Well, the whole album, sort of, it's always a thing that I listen to through in one listen. Like it's like I'll just put it on and I'll listen to the whole thing through, and just like be really like calm the whole time. Yeah, it's funny. It was, this particular one was between this record and Diesel and Dust by Midnight Oil, which is a very different record.
Totally different.
But to me, like gives this the same sort of feeling of like, calm. Like, oh, like I just feel like I'm at home when I'm listening to this record.
You mentioned that you like jazz. What other types of jazz would you listen to?
Well, I'm a big fan of the stuff from the 1950s and 60s. I referenced Mingus earlier. Like I'm a big fan of his Black Saint and the Sinner Lady album. At one time, I probably would have called that my favorite record of all time. But I don't think I can say that now just because it's so precious to me that I haven't listened to it all that much. Like I think I've listened to it only 2 or 3 times, just because a lot of the stuff on that record comes out of nowhere and is so unexpected that I don't want it to become a record where I know what's coming next. So
right, good. Yes.
I've only listened to it about, I think 3 times, just because I don't want to sort of spoil the magic. But I am, I'm a fan of more recent stuff too. Like I recently discovered like Wayne Shorter's 80s records, which apparently didn't get the best reviews, but I thought it sounded. I thought the music sounded really far out and really cool. I'm a big fan of vocal jazz as well. My favorite vocalist of all time is Ella Fitzgerald. She is probably actually the biggest influence on my own vocals. And I don't think that necessarily shows. It comes out differently, but that's also, I think, like what I was saying at the start of our discussion, when you do something and it's not quite right or not quite the same, that's how you open up new possibilities. I remember during the course of my research, I found another sort of like philosophical research article that was pointing out that when Elvis first came out, there was a comment that he was trying and failing to sound like Dean Martin.
Oh,
Yeah. And yeah, maybe he was trying and maybe he did fail to sound like Dean Martin, but in doing so, we got the voice of Elvis. You know what I mean?
That's
Which is
right.
arguably more iconic. So that's sort of my feeling with Ella too. It's like, well, I'm not going to sound like Ella Fitzgerald, but in sort of like taking some of these, phrasing ideas and taking some of these like tonal ideas, I can maybe make something else that's still interesting, as opposed to, sometimes I've noticed a lot of the time, like vocalists will follow trends according to their era. I think the big one right now, and I don't want to sound like I'm dunking on anyone because it's a completely legitimate way of singing. It's just not what I'm interested in. I know that like right now, the sort of like baby voice is really popular. Leah sort of sing, like this, and again, like that's maybe great for somebody else, but it's not for me. I want to sound like, something that I'm really into, and in my case, it's Ella.
Ella has quite a voice, that's for sure.
Very much so.
Now, an album that more people should hear.
An album that more people should hear. This one is probably the most obscure album on the list, with reason. It's Lolita Nation by Game Theory.
Trouser Press called it an ambitious and occasionally bizarre album with crazy noises.
Yeah, that is. I would say that is both a fair description, but it also sort of misses something. Scott Miller, who is the sort of leader and lead singer of Game Theory, who I regard as a genius, by the way. Very much an underappreciated genius. He said something about that record where he was saying he wanted to create an experimental record that wasn't abrasive. And I think he accomplished that, because a lot of the time it's very strange. It's odd. You don't know what's going to happen next, but it's tuneful, like it's not Overnight Sensation by Frank Zappa. It's maybe Overnight Sensation by Frank Zappa if Paul McCartney had written it. You know what I mean? It's it's very ambitious. It's, I think, a double album. And a lot of the songs are 40 seconds long. They're almost like snippets of songs. It's almost, at times you feel like you're changing the dials on a radio station from another planet. It's just full of cool moments. I mean, spoiler alert for anyone who listens to the album. If you've heard enough and you're sold and you want to go listen to Lolita Nation, pause, go listen to it and come back. But there's this one moment where they're playing this really raucous, noisy song called "The Waist and the Knees." And the way the song ends is it kind of falls apart, like how songs do. Like, everyone sort of is making a big noise and, gradually the instruments fall out, like they stop playing in rhythm and, the drums kind of like just, thud away, and all that's left is this one guitar figure that keeps repeating. It's an ostinato. It goes like, down, it's kind of a bend. Down, it keeps on doing that. And then after about like 4 or 5 times of this, it goes down, and then the rest of the band crashes in, and it's the next song. And that weird guitar figure, that almost atonal guitar figure, suddenly makes complete sense, and it becomes the main guitar riff of the new song, Nothing New. And I remember when I first heard that, like, it wasn't one of these things where you realize the genius after the fact. It was like, wow, like, I can't believe they just did, because you're expecting the song to peter away. You're not expecting it to go right into the next song in the way that it does. And I was like, wow, this is, it's really hard to think of this stuff, like when you're putting together a record. Like, it's easy to think like in concept, every song will fade into the next one or something like that. But it's hard to actually make it work in a way that doesn't feel forced. and I think you only realize that after you've actually like written an album. But that is just one moment among many. The lyrics are, I don't exaggerate, the lyrics are Dylan level, in my opinion, different in style to Dylan, but like as clever and as insightful and as expressive. There's a really good song called Chardonnay, which I think like hits that high. There's one verse off that song. Let's see if I can remember it here now. Yeah, he talks about, I know David Carradine changed a lot, Eastern wisdom, kung fu on Western thought, but was always missing that same spot, or knew but wouldn't say. A lot of life's best things are further than a Zen proverb away. It's, that like that's poetry, at that point. And I say more people should know this record, because it's really one of those records that only music people and like music journalists know, and at that, not many of those. I know that Scott Miller expressed a lot of regret about that. He wasn't sort of happy with his lot in life, is the impression I get. Like, he knew how good his band was. Like he once said something like, they were able to achieve regional success, but like national success always eluded them. It's true that, not every artist can be the Beatles, like especially when they're going for like really unique, crazy experimental ideas and not going for, oh baby, come dance with me. But I still think like I listened to that record. I'm like, this is still a band that got robbed of something. They were able to do a lot of good things. Like that album is produced by Mitch Easter, who was the lead singer of Let's Active, and who produced REM. Like if I got to do that, I would be like, okay, I can die now. Like I'm happy. But like at the level that this guy was writing, it still feels like not enough.
I'm definitely going to have to listen to it a few more times.
Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Now, the last album that you bought.
Yeah, the last album that I bought was The New Abnormal by The Strokes. And it's funny because I had to think about this one, because it's not very often anymore that you buy albums, but in this case, I actually did buy it. I bought it on vinyl. I was visiting Montreal, and there was this record store downtown that's, I think it was like, the night before I was going to come back to Ottawa. I'm like, oh, I need to go see this record store. So I went in right as they were closing. I think they were closing in 10 minutes. And I browsed around the vinyl there, and then I saw The New Abnormal, which was, a record I really enjoyed, and I'm really happy that the Strokes recorded it. I think it's actually maybe even better than Is This It? That's, I think, a bit of a hot take, but I actually do think it might be a more enjoyable listen, in my opinion. And I say that as someone who loves Is This It, their first record. But I think that some of the stuff that Julian Casablancas, the lead singer, does with his voice on that record, his falsetto has become out of this world, and sort of like, I like this record as kind of a reminder that like, you can be, especially in today's musical climate, you can be like in your 40s, or like, in your 50s, and not just still make good music, but you can still make music that's cool and that like young people will get jazzed about and will listen to and stuff. Like you can do that. It's no longer, and I think part of this is maybe because the internet has decentralized everything, and people can sort of like, to some limited extent, choose what they're exposed to, as opposed to, like it's, universal, who decides everything or whatever. just trying to remember how I was going to cap off that thought. Oh yeah, and the fact that they've improved as musicians too. I think, like, not that they were bad before, but especially in terms of like Julian's vocals. He sings like, I'll make the distinction this way. On Is a Sit, he sings a lot like a vocalist, but on The New Abnormal, he sounds like a singer.
Okay.
Yeah, if that distinction makes sense. Yeah, so I really like that record. I also picked up Giant Steps by John Coltrane, so I could have also put that in this slot, but I mean, I already had a Coltrane record on here.
You did, yeah.
Yeah, and I went up and I got both of those records, and I remember the guy working behind the counter who was having a conversation with another guy who was there, even though it was 5 minutes till close or something. And I remember he was like scanning me through, and then he was like, "Hey man, what do you think about this like plastic cover for the album?" I was like, "What do you mean?" And he pointed out that instead of being in a cardboard sort of sleeve like most vinyl albums are, it's in this sort of like hard plastic case.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I didn't realize that either. I didn't realize it when I bought it. I was like, oh, like, I mean, I guess it is what it is. And he was like, man, when Arcade Fire did this, people were mad, man. People were like, you're wasting plastic, you're harming the environment. And it was like, and I was like, oh yeah, I guess why use more plastic than you need to? It makes sense. But then I was like, but I don't know. I have a feeling that Arcade Fire's audience and the Strokes audience probably don't overlap in that respect quite as much. But yeah, great record, great production, great songwriting, great performances. I was really happy to listen to that one.
Now that's the end of your list, your choices. Yeah. I gave you an album to listen to.
That's right.
The First Day by David Sylvian and Robert Fripp.
Yes.
What were your thoughts?
I won't say surprised, but I definitely wasn't expecting what I was hearing. But that's not to say that it was unexpected. It was just not easy to predict what was coming next on the record. I think I mentioned to you when you recommended it to me that I'd heard Brilliant Trees.
Right.
I think that's probably the most famous solo record by him.
By David Sylvian.
By David Sylvian, yeah. I think one of the differences between the two records that you can hear quite palpably is Brilliant Trees, as experimental and as jazzy and as odd as it sometimes is, it's still a record where he's making, 3-minute pop songs, more or less. And, there are songs that are sort of like kind of designed to be hits, like Pulling Punches had a video and, Red Guitar, and you could sort of hear them as odd as they are getting airplay on MTV in the 80s. Whereas, on this record, The First Day, there was only one song where I thought that was even kind of a remote possibility, which was Jean-Luc Birdman. Right. Which was, I was not surprised to learn that was the single, because, I listened to that. I was like, oh, this is a catchy song. I think it's probably my favorite song off of the record. Just, off of, that time that I listened to it. The rest of it, to me, sounds like, refreshingly, I should say, especially for an album from the 90s, like an artist who does not care about pleasing people anymore, which is a good thing in my opinion. Like, he still very much cares about the quality of the music, obviously. He's very, he's collaborating with Robert Fripp. The music is obviously going to be, of a high caliber. But like that last song on the record where it's just, meditating into infinite space, it sounds like. So I thought that was very interesting. It's like, oh no, this is an artist who's just doing what he wants. One thing I also noted was his voice changed a little bit. It's still recognizably him as compared to Brilliant Trees or his time with Japan, but he's got a little bit more grit. He's being a little bit more expressive with his vocals, and he sounds a lot like Bono from the early 90s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, like
I haven't heard it that way, but yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like maybe there are some, like prog rock fans out there that would want to wring my neck for saying that. But there is, I mean, I can't lie. Like there was a point when I was listening actually to Jean-Luc Birdman. I was like, is Bono guesting on this? Like, is this like, like this is the single and they've brought Bono, on off of his like Achtung Baby sessions to listen to this or something. But no, it was David Sylvian. So I thought that was an interesting sort of wrinkle. And I think there was one more thing that I thought when listening to this record, which was the fact that it's so proggy. It's even listed. I noticed afterwards on like some like site called like My Prog Album List or something like that, which is you wouldn't have associated David Sylvian with prog rock. Earlier in his career, it would have been like new wave, sophistopop maybe. And I felt really vindicated when I learned this, because I remember when I first listened to Brilliant Trees some years ago now, there was a guy in another band that I knew. And actually, I'm not going to name drop or anything, but he's like experienced some success in the music industry now, like some palpable success. But at the time, he was kind of like a kind of just another local musician like I was. But he was really into prog, and he was in like a prog influenced band, and like into Rush and like Dream Theater and all of these things. And I at the time knew nothing about I didn't know that David Sylvian had collaborated with Robert Fripp or anything like that. I just knew him as, I knew that he sang in Japan, and I knew that he the band Japan, that is, not the country. And I knew that he had released this album Brilliant Trees, which I found because I was really into Scritti Politti at the time.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but I was listening to Pulling Punches. I remember I sent it to this guy who was really into prog music. I was like, listen, I know this is not your style of music, but like you should listen to this, like the bass reminds me of like Geddy Lee or something. And I don't know if he ever, like I didn't hear his feedback on the record. I don't know if he like took the song seriously or not. But when I like later learned, quite recently with this record, that David Sylvian had turned out to be like a bona fide prog musician, I was like, I really heard something there. I had a good ear there. So I felt a little bit vindicated, as opposed to being like, oh, why did I send this prog loving guy, this, sophistopop 80s musician who wears a suit,
Yeah, it's an album that is quite different from his other releases, and it has that, of course, King Crimson feel to it.
Yes.
And from what I've read, Robert Fripp was the one that kept knocking on David's door saying we should do something together, and David gave in.
Yeah. And, I have a feeling, because, I think I saw a quote where he said, if I hadn't made that record, I probably would have gone quiet. Like I would have just done nothing in the early 90s. And I remember like reading that. I was like, after listening to the record, I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Because like I was saying before, like it sounds like someone who like doesn't care about the sales, who doesn't care even about the reviews, maybe. Like he just wants to make music that's cool. He doesn't care about like putting together like a perfectly sequenced record. He cares about like, oh, like let's do something cool together, which is I think very genuine.
Let's see what happens.
Yes, exactly.
Which goes back to how we started everything.
Come full circle.
Full circle. Well, thank you very much for doing this. I've enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this immensely. It's lots of fun.
Well, I look forward in 4 years for your next release.
Okay, I'll drop you a line at that time and let you know when it's out.
Great. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was that was a fun time. Thank you very
Good.
much. Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Keep
Have a
well.
good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.